Good morning, church family. This is Pastor Greg again, and I want to share a devotional thought. I've entitled this thought, Luther's Counsel During the Plague. And the text that I would like to use, and this is for Monday morning, March 30, the text I'd like to use is Psalm 91, going back to Psalm 91, verses 1 and 2. And it says, He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God, in Him I will trust. I'm a big fan of Martin Luther. I enjoy studying history. I enjoy studying history in the context of God's movement. And I've always appreciated the Protestant Reformation time period, coming out of the Dark Ages. Two specific things that happened that allowed God's grace and His mercy and love, the gospel, the doctrine of salvation to just explode to the then known world. And the two things that God really used during that time, number one, the invention of the printing press, Gutenberg there in the early 1500s, that allowed people to be able to print in mass amounts, the Bible to be read in a language they could understand. And so no longer were they reliant upon priests to read from the pulpit, but they could for themselves, those who were learning also how to read, which was not real common, but they would be able to read the Bible for themselves. And then also the second thing is God found His man, and His man was Martin Luther. And Martin Luther, though there were many different reformers for several centuries before Luther as well and after, that had a part in the good news of Jesus and bringing about the Reformation that needed to take place in the church. God used the printing press, and He used Martin Luther. So I'm drawn to verse 2 here in Psalm 91 about God is our fortress. He is our refuge. And I'm reminded of, Martin Luther wrote many hymns, and the one that I think of most prominently when I think of his hymns that he wrote, his songs he wrote, is A Mighty Fortress is Our God. And several great places in the Bible that mention God as our refuge, God is our fortress. So as I'm thinking about Martin Luther, I'm drawn to a portion of his life in the 1500s where in Wittenberg, let's go back to August of 1527, the plague that had begun in the 1300s, from China again, where it had just spread throughout the bubonic plague, which became known as the Black Death, that plague had spread over all of Europe. And estimates are over 25%. I've seen estimates up to 50 and sometimes 60% in some European countries where the bubonic plague killed that many of the population. Just a tragic time. But the reason that I'm drawn to Martin Luther today is I'm thinking about his counsel that he gave in 1527 when his own city, Wittenberg, was also now being affected by the bubonic plague. And during that time, there was, a lot of thought running around in Wittenberg and surrounding German cities about whether or not people should flee and get out of their cities and run for their lives. And Luther's prince, Elector John, ordered Luther, he said, hey, you got to leave immediately, get out of there, you got to save your own life. But Luther chose during that time to stay in Wittenberg and to be hands-on ministering to those who had been stricken by the plague. So one German pastor named Johann Hess, he wrote Luther asking him how a pastor should behave when facing such a plague. And so as a result of that, Martin Luther wrote a pamphlet in 1527. It's entitled, Whether One May Flee from a Deadly Plague. And you can go online and just put that in your web browser, and you can read the whole letter. So again, the pamphlet is entitled, Whether One May Flee from a Deadly Plague. And it has a lot of good thoughts in there. I'll just share a few with you, and then I want to read a paragraph that to me applies so much, so applicable to what we are going through today with the coronavirus. So in that pamphlet, he starts off addressing this group of people that have a strong conviction that one should never flee. When a plague comes, you should never flee, because they saw the plague as being a result of God's judgment for the sins of the people, and that Christians should stand by humbly and accept God's will and should turn to God in repentance. And Martin Luther saw some value in that, but as he goes through his pamphlet, he shows that there's another side for us to consider. One of the things he mentions in his pamphlet is that people with leadership roles, like pastors and mayors and judges and physicians, that they should remain in the community until the crisis is passed. I thought that was really interesting. I agree with him. And he says, especially pastors should be, he called them this good shepherd, comparing them to the good shepherd. They are shepherds who lay down their life for the sheep. And he's quoting, of course, from John chapter 10, verse 11. So Luther went on in his pamphlet and he said that it would be sinful for parents to abandon their children. We would all agree with that. He said it would be sinful for any person to flee the city if another family member is dependent upon them. And even, he went further to say, even if your neighbor is stricken by the plague, you have no right leaving the city because you have an obligation to go and care for also your neighbor. Now, concerning one's behavior and demeanor during when this plague had come, this is what Luther has to say about that. He says that a Christian should have no fear of death because that's the devil's work. The devil is the one to come and give you fear. And he goes on to say that no Christian should yield to fear. And he uses Christ's resurrection as an example. He says Christ's resurrection should make all Christians fearless in the face of the grave. I mean, pretty strong, powerful words. Luther went on to say that Christians who trusted God and ministered directly to the dying should not fear boils. They should not fear infection. For in the end, caring for the sick is like caring for Christ. And he was using Matthew 25 when Jesus said, I was sick and you cared for me. So all of you healthcare workers, Luther would say, you're doing the work of Christ. That person that you are ministering to, keep ministering to them directly, hands-on, because you are administering the care. When you're caring for them, you're actually caring for Christ and Christ's own. So the thing that I started drawing my attention to in this article is the practical steps that Luther advocated to help contain the practice. Now, I want you to keep in mind, it wasn't until the 1850s. So this is 300 years before Louis Pasteur and the germ theory. Luther had the wisdom to already begin practicing and advocating in Wittenberg some of these practices that, of course, today we think of them as being quite common. We know about germs. We know about the spread of disease. But Luther advocated specifically for certain public buildings to be set aside alongside hospitals for the sick, like they would take public buildings, turn them into hospitals, rather than allowing the sick to be in hundreds scattered out in private homes. He also urged Christians to fumigate their homes, their yards, and the streets to stop the spread of the plague. I mean, again, the wisdom. And I'm convinced that God was given Luther, the Bible speaks of obtaining the wisdom of God. And Luther also urged that Wittenberg Cemetery should be moved outside the city limits with its walls decorated with biblical scenes to help minister and to bring peace and comfort to the grieving and those who were sick. So just practical steps that Luther take that I think is amazing. Now, think about this. So the coronavirus right now, as I'm sharing this with you this morning, Monday morning, there are almost 750,000 coronavirus cases. There have already been over 35,000 deaths worldwide, and in the United States, we have just topped the 145,000. So we're over 145,000 confirmed cases. And here in the United States, there already has been 2,611 deaths. And I'm like, wow, I mean, this is going to, it's growing. I heard statistics of a model this morning that the United States can expect between 100 and 200,000 deaths. I mean, friends, this is, while it's not the 25 million of the bubonic plague, actually, it was 50 million of the bubonic plague in Europe. It's still devastating what is happening here in the United States. So I'm drawn to Luther's Counsel because it has direct application to what we're going through today. And I want to read, before I close, one paragraph. This is the paragraph in the pamphlet that stood out for me, and I want you to hear the balance in Luther's counsel of how we as Christians should respond during a plague time. So here's what he was asked this question: how should we respond, by his friend who was a pastor? And he says, his answer is, I shall ask God mercifully to protect us. Then I shall fumigate, help purify the air, administer medicine and take it. I shall avoid places and persons where my presence is not needed in order not to become contaminated and thus perchance inflict and pollute others and so cause their death as a result of my negligence. He goes on, if God should wish to take me, he will surely find me, and I have done what he has expected of me, and so I am not responsible for either my own death or the death of others. Now catch this part. If my neighbor needs me, however, I shall not avoid place or person, but will go freely as stated above. See, this is such a God-fearing faith because it is neither brash nor foolhardy and does not tempt God. And when I read that paragraph from Martin Luther, I was like, wow, that is so balanced. We're going to do our part. We're going to stay away from others. We're not going to go to places where we're not needed. I mean, the social distancing that's being practiced here in America, I mean, Martin Luther would second that. But he also says that there's an obligation we have as Christians. If a neighbor, if someone is in need, what should we do? We're not gonna just close an eye or have a blind eye towards them. We're gonna go and we're gonna work for the sake of Christ. So I pray for balance in your life today. Please, in every way that you are able, be safe. Follow the guidelines that have been set forth from the governor and from our president. And follow those, but look for opportunities. Are there ways today that you can make a difference? A phone call, an email. Are you checking in with some of your neighbors and some of your church family? So I wanted to share with you today. I'm, as I mentioned, a big fan of Martin Luther, and I think his wisdom that he had in dealing with the plague that struck Wittenberg is just so appropriate, so apropos to our day of what we are going through. So be encouraged today. God is our refuge and our strength.